Remember Flash? You know the one. No. 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 I'm talking about this Flash. If you grew up on the internet in the 2000s, you probably remember a time when much of the web was powered by it. It was used for everything. Web pages, animation, games, advertisements, video players, really anything interactive. Even YouTube's old video player was Flash-based. Nowadays, however, practically nothing uses it, and its use is actively discouraged online by pretty much everyone. Adobe has stopped support for it, and most major web browsers plan to remove it entirely by the end of 2020. Flash now shares its place in the trash bin of outdated software alongside with Napster and LimeWire. So how did we get to this point? And why was Flash popular in the first place? And what else can I talk about Flash that will make people click off to a funnier and better edited video? Let's dive into it. This video is going to be about the complete history of Flash. Now I'm going to do it better and longer than those guys. First off, I want to make a distinction. When people say Flash, they're either talking about Flash the software or Flash player, and they're very much tied together. Flash the software is what they call a multimedia production tool, which just means you can use to create whatever. Flash Player, as the name suggests, is merely a program that plays stuff made with Flash, but when people say stuff like Flash is insecure, they're talking about the player, not the software itself. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Anyway, now that that distinction's clear, let's rewind back in time. The year is 1993, Jurassic Park was in theaters, Bill Clinton just became president, and I was -2 years old. Somewhere in Southern California, a small company was founded by Jonathan Gay and Charlie Jackson called Futurewave Software. Jonathan Gay was previously an employee at Charlie Jackson's company, Silicon Beach Software, which focused on making games and productivity software for the Macintosh. However, that company was purchased by Aldus Corporation back in 1990, so the two guys went to focus their attention on graphics software for pen computers. Futurewave's first product would be a vector drawing program for Pen.os OS called Smart Sketch. This product did not last long, as Pen.os OS was scrapped by AT&T in 1994. Pen computers just really weren't a hot thing at the time, I guess. So Futurewave then tried to release Smart Sketch on Windows and Mac, but their efforts were futile because they were shadowed by the more popular drawing programs at the time, Adobe Illustrator and Aldus Freehand. So after the failure of Smart Sketch, Futurewave Software used their knowledge of graphics software to instead focus on vector-based animation for web pages. By May 1996, they released their second software, FutureSplash Animator, along with their web viewer, FutureSplash Player. And it kinda looks like a makeshift early Flash already. You got your timeline, your toolbar, onion skinning, these arrows here appear to be tweens, yeah, you get it. FutureSplash Animator got the attention of MSN, Disney Online, and Fox. The Simpsons actually used FutureSplash Animator for the website, and it looks exactly like you'd expect. During this period, they tried to sell the software off to a couple of companies. Interestingly, Adobe declined to buy FutureSplash Animator. In December, only a few months after its release, the company Macromedia, known at the time for Authorware and Director, bought Futurewave Software. They took FutureSplash Animator, got rid of part of the name, made a couple small modifications, and essentially just re-released the software as Macromedia Flash 1.0. It was marketed as the easiest way to create small, fast, shockwave multimedia. Flash 2.0 came around in July 1997, and by then people were already seeing the potential in the product. Web designers enjoyed adding cool little animations to their websites. The small file sizes also made it ideal for people on the web with low bandwidth. For the rest of the 90s, Macromedia would continue to release a new version of Flash pretty consistently. Flash 2 came out with the object library and its own Flash player, Flash 3 added movie clips, transparency, and JavaScript plugin integration, Flash 4 heavily fleshed out their scripting implementation, and Flash 5 saw the introduction of ActionScript 1.0, which is a prototype-based language based off of ECMAScript. Basically, it means if you used JavaScript before, you'll feel kind of at home with ActionScript. Earlier Flash versions also had basic scripting actions for web design functions like buttons and forms, but ActionScript allowed for procedural and object-oriented programming, so now Flash had the ability to not only make websites, but fully fleshed out games. Speaking of Flash games... Sorry, what? Over the coming years, Flash Player would outgrow its browser plugin competitors like Java, QuickTime, and ActiveX, and eventually get bundled in with popular web browsers. So, following along with the naming conventions set out with the previous Flash versions, what do you think came out after Flash 5? That's right, MX. In 2002, I guess Macromedia wanted a redesign. They also wanted to combine all their software into this one big suite called the Macromedia Studio MX. The suite came with Flash, Dreamweaver, Fireworks, Freehand, and ColdFusion. It was, kinda sweet. Of course, you didn't have to buy the whole bundle, you could just get Flash MX, which comes with a new logo now too. It's an F. which probably stands for Flash. But what does MX mean? Apparently, it doesn't stand for anything. They just started calling it when they wanted to integrate all their products into one. No, seriously, that's what the literal chief technology officer said. MX as an acronym doesn't stand for anything specifically. MX as a concept refers to two things. It refers to the idea that, whatever, it's not important. The next version of Flash came out in 2004 and it was called Flash MX 2004. It kind of just updated the whole Macromedia suite thing.
Wow. Director MX 2004.
The biggest change was ActionScript 2.0, which added stuff to the language to make it more object-oriented. So now you have terms like class and interface, which made it easier for C and Java programmers to adopt ActionScript. You could also now use CSS for web pages somehow. I don't know, I'm not a programmer. So that's MX 2004. Now following along that naming convention, given that it's now 2005, what do you think the next version of Flash is called? Yep, correct, Flash 8. Now Flash 8 is a personal favorite of mine, mainly because it was the one that I personally grew up with. But one of its most significant changes was the addition of filters, so you can now add more pizzazz to your cartoon about stick figures fighting. I enjoyed it. It came with a professional version, the full program, and a basic version, which had a lot of its features stripped down. Flash 8 ended up being the last version to be released by Macromedia. And before I get into why, let's take a quick detour. By the mid-2000s, Flash Player made its way onto 95% of machines. You could say their media player expanded to a macro size.
No.
Flash at its peak had three major fronts: web development, game development, and animation. Let's start with the web developers. ActionScript allowed them to create a variety of different websites and internet applications. Flash allowed for video and audio playback, as well as being able to detect mouse input, keyboard input, microphones, and cameras. It wasn't the only browser plugin available to them, there are others like ActiveX and Java, but Flash had the benefit of having a small footprint, as well as being portable to most web browsers and just having a good user experience. As ActionScript matured, so did the applications being developed for it, and we started seeing these things called Rich Internet Applications, or RIAs, a term which actually is coined by Macromedia. Macromedia eventually came out with their own software development kit called Flex in 2004 that targeted RIA developers. So people were creating a wide variety of web content basically. Remember going to some random webpage and suddenly music bursts out of your speakers and you're watching some overly animated intro of some guy's personal website? That was 2005 for you. Most Flash websites have either died or been redesigned with better web technologies, so it's kinda hard to scour them out these days. The most popular one that's still up that I know of is homestarrunner.com, and they have an HTML5 alternative already. In the gaming world, Flash was the tool to go to if you want to create visually appealing games quickly. You could also create games through Java and Shockwave, but Flash was definitely the most widespread, probably because it was the most accessible to newcomers. Creating graphics was simple because you could draw it all within Flash, and then convert those into objects and program it with ActionScript, so it was all contained in one program. And then you can upload your games on sites like Newgrounds, Miniclip, Armor Games, Congregate. There were a bunch of Flash websites back then. Heck, just put it on your own domain and share that around. It's the 2000s, people don't care about clicking on random websites. A whole gaming culture online started evolving from Flash. I'm sure everyone has memories playing random-ass Flash games. I certainly do. Eventually, some sites started paying developers to host their games. It was a decent way to make some extra money, and it inspired people to get into game development. So a lot of indie game developers working today that you might know have roots making Flash games. But that's not all. It turns out Flash was actually a great program for making fully fledged cartoons, too. Some animated TV shows use Flash as their main animation software. Harvey Birdman, Foster's Home, Hi Hi Puffy Amiyumi, and Home Movies were a few animated series that are made in Flash around the time. Of course, a bulk of the good stuff was uploaded online. Animation on the web was popular on sites like Newgrounds, Something Awful, Albino Black Sheep, and eventually YouTube. The thing with web animation, and this goes with games too really, is because of the whole Wild West nature of the internet, you could find cartoons that you wouldn't ever dream of finding on TV. And it's not so much that they were offensive, which they were, I'm not gonna lie, but people had complete, uncensored creative freedom without worry of having to follow any standards or expectations. So you can just animate whatever the f*** and people might find it interesting. Flash is mainly what brought animation onto the web. So that's briefly what's going on with Flash in the 2000s. Let's go back to where we were. Macromedia Flash 8 was the last Flash to be released by Macromedia. A certain company saw all this hype in Macromedia's sweet line and they wanted in on the action. So you know what they did? They bought them. On April 18, 2005, Adobe Systems Incorporated bought Macromedia for $3.4 billion in stock, their largest acquisition up until then. With that, future versions of Flash and Macromedia's other programs would be bundled into Adobe's Creative Suite package, and so the next iteration of Flash would come out in 2007 and be known as Adobe Flash CS3. Professional. ActionScript 3.0 came with the release of CS3, which turned out to be more of a rewrite from the ground up than an upgrade from 2.0. It was more strictly typed, and they once again improved its object-orientedness. It's all about objects these days, I guess. You could also now program entirely outside of Flash's timeline. The language came out with rather mixed reactions, some arguing that it shouldn't even be called ActionScript because it was so different. It ran on a completely separate virtual machine, meaning you couldn't even run the stuff you made with previous versions of ActionScript. And quite frankly, a lot of people found it inconvenient to have to relearn the language. In fact, for many future iterations of Flash, they actually gave you the choice to create a file with either ActionScript 2.0 or 3.0. But the dust eventually settled and 3 became the standard. I mean, ActionScript 3 wasn't bad. In fact, it was pretty good. It generally ran faster than 2, and the syntax changes made writing large-scale applications more logical and easier to debug, even though simple programs often took more lines of code. So it was just different to people. Not long afterwards, Adobe released a cross-platform runtime environment for ActionScript developers called Adobe Air, or as I like to call it, Adobe Integrated Runtime. It's kind of like a superset of FlashPlay and Flex that focuses on development of stuff outside the web browser, and it comes with additional libraries to support that. Anyway, continuing on with Adobe's line of products, you had CS4, CS5, CS5.5, CS6, and then the CC line, CC, CC 2014, and finally CC 2015. Each iteration just adding more stuff. Do I have to explain all of them? Okay, let's shift focus away from describing every single iteration of Flash. It is now the early 2010s, and guess what? Things have changed online. The mobile market exploded, new technologies on the web are being developed, and everyone's getting more and more concerned with security. So people are starting to have second thoughts about this whole Flash thing. On April 29, 2010, a kind man named Steve Jobs, CEO of some fruit company, you might have heard of it, wrote an open letter regarding his thoughts on Flash, appropriately titled, Thoughts on Flash. So after facing public backlash for not supporting Flash on any of his mobile devices, Jobs explained why in detail in his letter. First off, he had issues with Flash being 100% proprietary and believes web standards should be open like HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript. Second, the criticism from Adobe that not having Flash on iPhone is cutting off a huge chunk of the web to its users is a moot point because most popular web players are available on different formats other than Flash. Additionally, while Flash games are unsupported, the App Store has plenty of other games to play. Those are Steve Jobs' actual words. Third, Flash has atrocious security, is unreliable on Macs, and performs terribly on mobile. Fourth, I'm not sure why this has its own segment, but it drains battery. Fifth, Flash was designed for desktops and most things wouldn't translate properly on touch-based devices. For example, controls that rely on mouse hover. And sixth, Jobs simply did not want an extra third-party layer on their phones, essentially stating that if people relied on another party's technology, like Adobe's, that third party is then in control of innovating and pushing the platform forward. For example, people would be less inclined to take advantage of iPhone-specific features because they'd rather use a development tool that supports multiple devices, and thus, as Jobs states, developers would be relying on the lowest common denominator set of features. So yeah, eat shit, Adobe. The CEO of Adobe, Shantanu Narayan, responded to Jobs later stating, well, he's got a point. Just kidding, he went to the Wall Street Journal and said that the letter was an extraordinary attack against Adobe. He says that they have been true to their vision that they should help people deal with cross-platform support. He goes on to state that the accusations about Flash draining battery life are patently false, and that the problems with Flash crashing was a failure of Apple's systems, not Adobe's. He also mentions that Apple's restrictiveness makes it cumbersome for developers to work on many devices, and that they will now have to adopt two workflows if they want their applications to be on other platforms. True indeed is that. So whether or not you agree with Apple's or Adobe's philosophy here, Apple made the decision to not support Flash, and as we all know, Apple devices are still wildly popular. In a later interview, Steve Jobs mentioned that they never intended there to be a huge debacle over iPhones and iPads not supporting Flash. It was only when Adobe started going to the press trashing Apple for that decision that Jobs decided to release an open letter response and then tear the menu asshole into the space-time continuum. He mentions in the same interview that Flash is beyond its heyday and that HTML5 is on the rise, so people should focus their interests on adopting that instead. Sorry, Adobe. People often blame Steve Jobs and Apple for killing Flash by not supporting Flash Player in their products, but I don't think that's entirely the case. I think Flash Player was doomed to fall eventually, and Apple merely accelerated that reality. The thing is, Flash Player was plagued with way too many problems. By the 2010s, the lightweight, speedy web player started to become bloated, as features kept being added and applications being made for it became large. Not to mention you had to preload everything up front, so web pages now took longer to load. It was also bad for search engine optimization because search engines can't read text inside of a Flash file. More importantly though, people are always throwing around the phrase, Flash is insecure, but do any of these people actually know why? Yeah, probably a few of them. I'm sure there's plenty of people actually. But for everyone else, yeah, Flash is insecure. Not Flash the program, that's just a cool software that sits on your computer. Flash Player is insecure. And in order to explain why, we have to switch to the next segment of this video. It's hard to talk about Flash's security without talking about the history of web browsers in general. Back in the late 90s, people were starting to get tired of looking at bad HTML with ugly GIFs, Jesus Christ. If you wanted to extend your browser's functionality, you had to install plugins, which were executable programs integrated in the browser. Netscape Navigator and Internet Explorer were two competing web browsers that had their own set of plugins, but Flash, being developed by a third party, could deliver a bunch of extra functionalities on either browser, so you could see how this would be appealing to a lot of people. And that was its main goal. Flash was created in a time where security wasn't really taken into consideration. Like, at all. Eventually this became a huge issue as Flash became more popular and people really started to understand the underlying technology. It was also very widespread, which malware creators love. Many zero-day exploits were found, some allowing for arbitrary code execution, which basically means, rather than spending millions rewriting the software and potentially breaking thousands of websites in the process, the best the developers of Flash could do was patch every single security exploit they found, like a big game of whack-a-mole. Over time, the extra functionalities Flash provided became integrated with the core web tools. HTML5, JavaScript, CSS, WebGL, they all mostly caught up with what Flash was capable of, but they did it better and with security in mind. And these things took years to plan and develop. Web standards have come a long way. Flash, being such an old technology, just said, yeah, fuck it, you can do all this stuff now, have fun. Before realizing, oh shit, maybe it's not a good idea to have something that can connect to anywhere on the internet, be able to read and write to a local file system. Maybe we shouldn't allow it to run automatically behind the scenes when a web page is loaded. Mix this in with a ton of people running outdated versions with a confusing versioning system, being a separate executable from the browser and thus being an entirely different attack vector, and being so ubiquitous online, and now you're dealing with something quite dangerous. Browsers also moved away from supporting executable third-party plugins to just extensions, which are essentially just source code that's executed inside the browser's sandbox that follows a strict API. In fact, Flash is the only remaining plugin that Chrome still supports. To give credit, most of the issues I've mentioned have been addressed, and Chrome's integration of Flash runs inside Chrome's sandbox. But by the time Adobe could really address these flaws, Flash's reputation was completely tarnished, and the other non-proprietary web tools were on the rise. So the reason why Flash is insecure is simply because it provided too many features early on without considering security. But considering the time it was made, could you really blame it? Eventually people just started to move away from Flash. Web developers now wanted a tool that could easily render on both desktop and mobile devices, so they looked towards emerging JavaScript and HTML5 frameworks at the time. Many Flash game developers found the market for small casual games inside app stores instead of the web, so many started developing for Apple and Android devices. Those who didn't want to go mobile had the option to adopt Unity, which became free in 2009 and could now be rendered and played online with the help of WebGL. Or they just used some other game technology, I don't know, there's a lot out there. So everyone just kinda moved on. There's also Adobe Air, which is still around, kinda. It was bought by some company called Harmon in 2019, a subsidiary of Samsung. I doubt many people still use that. Although there's still one community that continues to use Flash through all of this, and that's animators. See, animators don't really have to deal with the insecurity that Flash is known for. You can always just export your animation to a video format. In 2016, Adobe rebranded the name of their software from Flash CC Professional to Adobe Animate, signifying its push towards a pure animation tool. And it now exports directly into HTML5, so the technology is still there, even though the name Flash and its presence on the web is dead. In a way, there's two opposing attitudes when it comes to the death of Flash. Tech-minded people were happy that they could finally get rid of this dangerous proprietary resource hog of a plugin that's been plaguing them for years. Casual online gamers, on the other hand, couldn't help but feel saddened by the fact that the games they grew up with would no longer be easily accessible, if at all. There are people out there trying to convert Flash content to modern formats and preserve the past, but despite these efforts, I fear that the more obscure content may still be lost within the wind of it all. As our generation gets older, people are starting to realize the impact that old Flash content had on us. Maybe one day, we'll start to look at Flash games the same way we do NES games currently. Or maybe not. I suppose the lesson here is, technology moves on. Flash is in the past now. In a few years, maybe we'll see, I don't know, HTML6. Jonathan Gay, the original author of Flash, stated in a 2016 interview with Redgate that Flash found a moment in time when there was a very significant audience for its capabilities. Today, people's energy is going into building rich HTML applications and native mobile applications. See, even the gays approve. I'm so sorry. That was bad. Never mind.